3.
Good morning, Professor No. My name is Deborah Smith. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about law enforcement suicide and PTSD. Let me introduce who I have with me today. I have coworker and friend Shelly Masters, my dad, Mr. John Gleason, my mother, Miss Marie Gleason, and the cameraman is my wonderful husband, Jeff Smith. Law enforcement officers are pretty subject to life-threatening crises daily. What happens is that they end up not being able to deal so much with the traumatizing event, and it causes them to have some serious mental issues. They can develop what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and even threaten or commit suicide. In order for us to understand what I'm talking about, we need to define what post-traumatic stress disorder is. According to the Department of Veteran Affairs, can you still see me? It's a mental disease that occurs after somebody's been through some kind of traumatic event in their life. Could be anything from war, divorce, shooting somebody, any kind of traumatic event or something that they deem as traumatic event. Take yourself out of the situation, put yourself in a law enforcement officer's position. Imagine you have to decide between yourself and the life of somebody else. How would you be able to deal with it? How would you be able to reconcile going home to your family at night while somebody else couldn't at your hands? There are different types of stressors that they deal with on a regular basis. You got your personality conflicts, your personality stressors. These are your type A people. They are those that get that guilty feeling when they don't do something perfect. They have to constantly have acceptance. They have to need to be liked. They need to do things right. This is a typical law enforcement officer. You have your environmental stressors. You have to make that quick decision. Temperature changes. We live in Florida. Temperatures of 97 degrees during the day on a good day in the summer. Officers are wearing polyester uniforms, a 30-pound belt, and a 20-pound vest. Causes them to be 120 degrees underneath their uniform. Noises, different noises, shots fired, the sirens, all that can affect them. Then you have your psychosocial stressors. These are those that are created from issues within families, marital problems between husbands and wives, issues with coworkers. They can all play a part in developing a PTSD. Stress is the major cause of PTSD and suicide. What I mean by stress is your body's response to something that's changed in their environment. It could be something simple. You can have helpful stress, which we call eustress. This is the type of stress that make you a better person. They make you more creative. They preserve your happiness. They just make things better for you. And then you have your distress. That's where we have the problem, those negative impacts. They can impact you negatively on your health, your personal relationships, your relationships with your family, and your coworkers, and even affect your employment status. When we think about law enforcement officers, we think about their environmental stress and then their personal experiences. Again, dealing with nothing but trauma all day. Stress causes suicide and PTSD when people are unable to reconcile what they've been through or what they've seen or what they're doing. They can't tolerate that stress anymore. It can be acute, which is an immediate onset, chronic or cumulative being developing over a period of time. Everybody has their own threshold for handling stress. It's when you get to that top of that threshold and you supersede it, or you go over it, is when you have a problem, when you can develop PTSD and even start to think about suicide and actually commit suicide. This is when we have the problem. If you leave these untreated, you end up having more problems than it's worth. You can get child spousal abuse, violence, you become a very cynical person, you no longer live with those rose-colored glasses on, as people say. Anxiety disorders, panic disorders, phobias. People become afraid of hearing a popping sound. Fireworks sound like gunshots. They get afraid of that. They isolate themselves from not only their family, but their coworkers and their friends. Some become homeless, develop medical disorders. At some point in the law enforcement officer's career, they're going to develop and experience some kind of traumatic event. Their situation could be different, and each officer will handle it differently. Some will say, oh hey, that was just a learning experience. Others will develop a debilitating disease. The problem with law enforcement officers is that they tend to suffer in silence. Law enforcement officers are supposed to be brave, strong, resilient. Showing any kind of weakness when it comes to mental disorder will create a problem. They will see themselves as weak. They won't be that brave, strong individual that they're supposed to be when it comes to being a law enforcement officer. That's when the breakdown starts to happen. Just a little statistics. In 2008, there were 141 police officer suicides. 2011, it was 147. 2012, it was 126. Well, I don't have that up there. I found that as part of my research. These are just the ones that we know about. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's how many there were. Unfortunately, we have the media, the public, and different law enforcement agencies that actually foster the myth that law enforcement officers cannot suffer from any kind of stress. They are immune to it. It doesn't affect them. They're absolutely incorrect. Makes these officers, again, suffer in silence. Officers are not only prone to stress, they're probably more susceptible to it than the general public. It's the nature of their job that causes them to create and have these kinds of issues. We, as society and law enforcement agencies, cannot anymore ignore it. We have to be able to help treat these officers. Main causes of PTSD, of course, is the job. Imagine going to a child abuse call, a domestic violence where a female gets beat up, a rape, a murder scene, a severe accident where a child passes away. Could you imagine having to deal with that on a regular basis, every day, all day? We normally, as law enforcement officers, carry out our duties with valor and dedication until something like this occurs. They may hit their breaking point, and it could be just a simple argument with their wife when they got home from work that creates their breaking point. They could walk in the door, take one look at their wife, and just walk out and say, I'm done, I can't deal with this anymore, I've had it. These are just some of the examples that I just gave you about the types of scenes that law enforcement officers have to deal with. They can precipitate the PTSD condition. Unfortunately, they're difficult to identify, as most people, like I said before, suffer in silence. It takes time between the traumatic event and the development of symptoms in order for them to be able to say, yeah, you've got some issues going on. Officers, family, friends, and coworkers, supervisors, anybody near or around them need to be aware of what exactly PTSD is, what exactly some of the symptoms are, and how to affect them and how to help them. Most of these officers will learn about it, but that doesn't mean that they do what they're supposed to do to protect themselves from it. Some of the symptoms are going to include intrusion issues, somatic problems, arousal, and avoidance, and we'll go through those as we go on. Intrusion. You develop that extreme paranoia. Somebody's out to get you. Somebody's always looking at you. There's always somebody there. Nightmares. Self-explanatory. You have that sense of shortened future and impending doom. Oh my God, I'm going to die today. Somatic problems are just that. They are effects of the body. Different ways stress and PTSD can affect your body as a whole. Diarrhea, constipation, irritable bowel syndrome, the high use of antacid or extreme belching. Problems urinating, chest pains. Chest pains is a big one for PTSD. Avoidance. You avoid anything and everything that makes you happy. You don't go to your favorite places, you're depressed, you avoid work, you have no motivation, you sleep too much. I think I can be subject to that every now and again, working shift work. You have addictions to drugs, sex, or alcohol. You frequently disappear. Nobody knows where you are for hours on end. Memory loss, poor recall. You just numb out. You don't want to be a part of anything or anyone. That heightened sense of arousal. This is that state, that ready state that law enforcement officers live in on a regular basis. Hypervigilance. They have obsessive behavior. They're irritable. They don't want to deal with anything really. They have problems falling asleep and staying asleep, even if they do fall asleep. They have issues with the administration and the public. They're cynical. They can overeat, weight gain, or not eat, and have extreme weight loss. They're more hyperactive and they tend to be more violent. Why is it important that we study this? Well, isn't a human life worth saving? It's kind of important. Well, we need law enforcement to handle our issues. It's a physically and emotionally dangerous job for them. They face the effects of violence, murder, child abuse, rape on a daily basis. While most agencies in this world don't have these on a consistent, regular basis, it does happen. The nature of the work has long hours, exposure to tragedy, and rotating shifts. And I can tell you from personal experience that rotating shifts is annoying. It's absolutely difficult for us to really tell what the prevalence of this is in law enforcement because they do suffer in silence. It's not openly discussed. People don't talk about it. Nobody wants to know what's wrong with the law enforcement officer down the street. Nobody cares what's wrong with the law enforcement as long as they're protecting them. They view suicide and any kind of mental suffering as dishonorable. It's not a thing for law enforcement. Again, we need to be strong, we need to be brave, we need to be able to deal with other people's problems and not our own. There's the other statistics I found about suicide. 2012 had 126, 2008 had 141. That doesn't mean that there weren't more. Some of them don't go unreported, some of them get put down as line of duty deaths, so the spouse will get their benefits. How do we treat it? Well, we need to create critical incident stress debriefings. After every single incident within the first 24 to 72 hours, you need to get a hold of that law enforcement officer and you need to make sure that they're okay. You need to get them to see a psychologist or a mental health professional to make sure they're reconciling what they're doing, what they're talking about. You want to do it as a specific incident or as in general. Most of the time it's done against the specific incident alone. You want to use the individual approach mechanism. When I talk about incident debriefing, there are 7 phases that go into the incident stress debriefing. First one's going to be your introduction phase, and that's exactly what it is. They introduce you to stress debriefing, they tell you what's going to happen, they encourage you to participate in it. It can be a little overwhelming to some people, if anybody's been involved in one, but they're absolutely necessary. Fact phase, we find out what the officers would do in the event, have done or would do if the event ever happened to them, if they weren't directly involved. The thought phase, we try to get into the mind of the officer, find out what they're thinking about the incident, what they're thinking about how they handled the incident, anything to get into their mind and find out what's going on with them. And then you have the reaction phase. You want to help them move from one cognitive level to the other. You want them to help accept what they did, why they did it, and how they can overcome it. You have the symptom phase where you describe what occurred. After you, say, shot somebody, how did you feel? What were your symptoms? What went on? Did you go home and scream and yell at your wife? Did you go home and punch a pillow? Did you go home and go to the range and take it out on some paper? What did you feel? Did you experience symptoms of distress? And if you did, how did you deal with it? the education phase, which is where we all come together and put everything together and say, okay, what happened? What kind of responses did each person give? What kind of responses did the agency give as a whole to that officer for doing what they did? And then your re-entry phase, which is where we get that officer or officers back to work. We get them back into life. We handle any additional comments or questions that they might have, but you want to get them back working, back doing what they're supposed to do. It helps them adjust better. Suicide itself is not impulsive. However, it's an outcome of a thought process and a plan. You create a plan to commit suicide. Most people, if they're set on committing suicide, do not call for help. If they're calling for help, that means they're not exactly sure if that's really what they want to do. They could be triggered by more than one factor. Again, it could be a culmination of a traumatic event, divorce from your wife, anything. Some of the factors include depression, physical pain, access to firearms. Law enforcement factors that contribute to suicide: marital problems, alcohol use, access to actual weapons, which most have many, the public mistrust that's going on these days, long and irregular work hours, issues with the administration. When you take the individuals with the long, strong desire to die and those that have the ability to actually do it, is where you create the danger zone. It's a very small population of people that can actually have both instances, but you need to have both in order to actually commit suicide. Again, the intense desire to die and the ability to do lethal harm. It's going to be Joyner's model. When it comes to Joyner's model with law enforcement suicide, the nature of the work gives the officers the ability for self-harm. It gives them the weapon, basically. It puts the weapon in their hand. And then they have the extreme amount of stress that they have. When you tie it all together with depression, you got the model that's complete and suicide is done. That's when people actually do it. How do we prevent it? It's kind of difficult. They don't like to speak about it. Again, they suffer in silence, so it's difficult to prevent. So agencies, family, they need to remind the law enforcement officer that everything that they do is confidential. They don't have to give their name. The agency doesn't know if they went to seek out mental health professional to get through some of the things that they are going through. So it is confidential. They must be cognizant of the signs of depression. You look at that person that you're talking to. If they're a friend, if they're a family member, look at the differences in their attitude. Look at the differences in their appearance. They're going to get sloppy. They're going to be constantly tired. They're going to avoid you. Again, it's an issue that we can no longer overlook. We have to address it. Agencies, departments, they need to familiarize with this kind of an issue. They need to take themselves and really learn about what can happen. They need to address and create strategies for mental wellness. Create some kind of wellness challenge. Have the officers go and do exercises. Exercise is one of the best things. It creates endorphins. Endorphins make us happy. So do something to help prepare them and make them happy and get them the help that they're going to need. You want to implement some strategies, and you want to aim the strategies for prevention, intervention, and postvention. You want to try to prevent it from the beginning. You don't want it to happen, so let's train these guys to keep themselves happy and keep themselves educated on how to handle stress. Recruit leaders that actually care about your officers. That is a big thing. When law enforcement officers deal with administration that just doesn't care, it creates a problem. They need to be resilient. officers themselves need to be resilient. They need to introduce some kind of mental wellness program. You need to tell them why it's important. They need to invest in training of personnel and families. It's not just the law enforcement officer that needs the training. Get their spouses involved, get their parents involved. This way they know what to look for when it happens and if it does happen. You need professional counseling, peer counseling. Peer counseling is great. I know I use my shift to bounce things off of. When there's a particularly stressful incident, we come together as a shift and talk about it as a whole to get it out, get our feelings out. It's important. You want to use chaplains. I know we have four chaplains here at the Sheriff's Office, St. Charles County Sheriff's Office. We have a critical incident. There's one in the comm center with us dispatchers checking on us, making sure we're okay. Stress education program. There is absolutely no reason why you cannot go to a stress education class. Best class ever. You get to come in lawn chairs and sit on the floor and meditate. You can even go to sleep for a couple hours if you'd like. Pre-retirement counseling. One of the biggest issues for retirement people is getting out of law enforcement. You're out of that constant ready state. Now what do? Well, I'm no longer going to help people. Now what do? Most retirees are susceptible to depression, to suicide for that reason. Family education program, like I said before, get your family involved, get the law enforcement family involved. Make sure that everybody understands what they're looking for. No fault firearms securing policy. Intervention. If something happens, that's when the agencies need to intervene. Get them a mental health professional. Make sure that they understand what they're dealing with on a regular basis. You want to make sure you avoid that suicidal behavior. If you see it happening, pull them aside, get them off the street, get their guns away from them. Make sure that you have the ability to help them. You want to focus on officers that are higher risk, including veterans, retirees, and disabled officers. Veterans, coupled with being a law enforcement officer, can tend to be an issue. They have flashbacks, they have issues with war. Now they come in here and they hear shots fired. It could remind them of, let's say, Normandy, just for use of a place. Professional counseling, peer counseling, use of police chaplains. Again, this also needs to be put into the intervention phase. If I see somebody on my shift, I'm going to get my shift together as a whole and say, hey, Shelby, what's going on? We as a family, as a shift family, want to make sure that you're okay. Tell us what's going on. Let's help. Pull it together. You want to support the family following death of an officer by suicide. If it does occur, you want to make sure that you're there for that family. You want to make sure that you're there to help them. You got to do what's right. Suicide's never good. Suicide's never happy. Suicide is never a way to go. But if it does happen, you want to make sure you're there to help them. You want to make sure the funeral policies are in place, media relations are in place, the agency and the families get together as a whole. Make sure that there is post-incident counseling for your officers. Here are just some important statistics I decided to add at the end of this PowerPoint. 2/3 of officers in the United States involved in shooting suffer moderate to severe emotional problems. That's a lot. The average age of an officer at the time of suicide was 42. I turned 41 this year. That's kind of scary. Average age on the job was 16 years. I know a lot of people in this agency that are here just at 16 years. 91% were male. 40 to 44 years old were the most susceptible years. 15 to 19 years of service were the most risky. 63% of the victims were single, which is actually strange for me. I wouldn't have thought that, honestly, at that age that they were single. Military veterans, 11%. 91.5% used firearms. Personal problems before the suicide at 83%. It goes to show that there are personal issues that can help lead towards suicide. And New York and California had the highest rate. Probably the most populated states. hence the reason for the highest rates. That actually concludes my PowerPoint today. I appreciate you guys for coming and supporting me. Thanks.